Previously on Transformers University, we covered the first season and a half of Transformers, the original cartoon series, and we've met the entire cast from both seasons, and now we continue on with 5 more episodes of Season 2. We'll head into space, we'll go around New York and San Francisco, and we'll find out the secret of Omega Supreme. All that, much more, right now on Transformers University. Hello, my friend, and welcome to Transformers University. I am your host, Anthony Brucali, owner-operator, madman behind the website TFU.INFO and everything associated with it. And welcome to Transformers University. First off, before we get started, a couple of quick things. One, if you listen to the audio version of the previous episode, the Meet the Cast Season 2 Part 2, I do implore you to go check it out on YouTube. The video version is much cooler than just the audio. And you can find that at youtube.com/TFU.INFO. And while you're there, make sure you subscribe and make sure you ring that bell for notifications, because next week, actually this week, coming up, the weekend of October 4th, Thursday, through October 7th, I will be covering New York Comic-Con and all of the Transformers offerings, plus a whole bunch of other things I enjoy, like Netflix's Voltron, Valiant Comics. Hopefully I'll get a chance to get to that introduction of the new Netflix She-Ra show, plus pictures from the floor, and I will be meeting up with the Hasbro Transformers team to do a little Q&A that one afternoon. So, a lot of that will be going out live on the YouTube channel, and of course there will be videos after the con also on the YouTube channel. So please go over to youtube.com/TFU.INFO and subscribe today. That said, we're going to jump right into where we left off in the cartoon to the next episode. And the next episode we're going to cover is episode 42 overall, episode 26 of Season 2, and that is The God Gambit, and that is written by Buzz Dixon. Now, you may know Buzz Dixon a little better as one of the story editors on a show called G.I. Joe. Buzz wrote just a handful of Transformers episodes, but this one is one of them, and I gotta say, The God Gambit is pretty cool. It does tackle a subject you wouldn't likely find in a children's cartoon. And for a little bit more on that, we're going to go to Buzz Dixon himself.
But they let us tackle some pretty deep themes and emotional ideas and whatnot. The God Gambit, which I wrote for Transformers, you couldn't even mention religion, much less engage in a debate between atheism and any kind of theology. And the God Gambit is a story in Transformers where some of the Decepticons pretend to be gods to a race of aliens in order to get the aliens to do their bidding. And you end up, the story, it's action-packed, but it's also got this theological debate going on in it. How do you know you are following the correct path? How do you even know that a God exists? And the networks wouldn't even let us put crosses in graveyards. If you were doing Scooby-Doo, you couldn't have a cross in the graveyard because they were afraid that it would either offend the Christians or it would offend the non-Christians. I mean, that's how silly it became.
I think that hammers home a good point about the Transformers cartoon overall, is that at times the storytelling was a bit unconventional and the subject matter was also a bit unconventional and over kids' heads to some extent, and written a bit more mature than what you would think it would be. And speaking of Buzz Dixon, just overall, he did write my favorite episode of G.I. Joe, and that was Once Upon a Joe. And that's another one that I think is one of those episodes that it's a little bit smarter than the audience you think it's intended for. But back to the God Gambit. So here in this episode, we start on an alien planet, which we later find out is the surface of Titan, Saturn's moon. And there's this mechanical god statue being prepared called the Sky God. We meet Jero, played by Ed Gilbert, who is the high priest and tribal leader. We meet one of the worshippers named Scrawny, voiced by Paul Eiding. And we meet Talaria, who is voiced by Linda Gary, and she is the leader of the rebellion. And in one of the opening scenes, she leads a rebellion against this statue in this house of worship and destroys the statue. We cut away to Cosmos being chased by Astrotrain, and Thrust and Starscream are aboard Astrotrain. Cosmos is shot down and crashes on Titan. When he crashes, they are having a debate about whether or not the Sky Gods really exist. And Astrotrain makes this observation.
These fools worship Transformers.
So Astrotrain takes it upon himself as they arrive at the crash site of Cosmos and declares himself a Sky God and is immediately worshipped as Astrotrain demands obedience. They take in Cosmos, who's been captured, who has one wire loose, which is what is incapacitating him. And when they haul him off, Talaria follows. She notices the wire reconnects it and instantly FaceTimes with Optimus Prime. From there, a signal beacon is sent to the Autobots, and Cosmos is reactivated, and the Autobots are on their way to help.
Talk excessive. Time limited.
Elsewhere, Jero shows the Decepticons these power crystals in a cave just before the Autobots land on Titan, and Omega Supreme sort of runs out of power and crash lands and is left in a precarious position, one that Jazz and Perceptor observe as they leave him for the moment. And Omega Supreme, not terribly happy about it.
Just don't move.
Sarcasm not appreciated.
Jazz and Perceptor meet Talaria and tell her they aren't gods. Jazz takes down Starscream by, you guessed it, hitting him with a rock. He also climbs on top of Starscream, who had fallen on his back in jet mode, and Jazz climbs basically right on top of him, like he's holding him down. Starscream then transforms underneath Jazz, and Jazz proceeds to put his hands around Starscream's neck. I don't know if strangling a Decepticon works, but apparently Jazz thought so. The Titans, per Astrotrain's orders, shoot Jazz with some of those unstable energy crystals from the cave. Jazz is defeated, and Talaria is captured. Eventually, Jazz and Perceptor are led to the caves by some of the Sky God worshippers, where Perceptor realizes these crystals are highly unstable crystallized energy. And they also find electric lava made from the same substance as the crystals. Perceptor takes some of these crystals to Omega Supreme and refuels him just in time. Jazz goes to the temple to save Talaria from the altar of sacrifice. Just in time for Perceptor and Omega Supreme to arrive. Astrotrain decides that if he can't have the crystals, no one can. Proceeds to blow up the cave and the crystals, and presumably Jero.
Die like the worm you are.
The Autobots rescue the Titans from the explosion by getting them away from the cave across a crevasse, and Omega Supreme uses his tracks as kind of a bridge and drives his base mode across the tracks in a really odd piece of animation. And that basically wraps up the story. The people of Titan now have a new home, and Cosmos is repaired, and presumably the Autobots use whatever crystal fuel they had to make it back to Earth. And one of the neat little tidbits about this episode, it is one of the few to not contain Megatron at all, nor does it contain a single character voiced by Frank Welker. And that takes us to the next episode, episode 27 on the season, 43 overall. Make Tracks, written by David Wise, and this is kind of the Tracks feature episode. And I know in some of the Meet the Cast segments, we've chronicled basically the cast and their origins in acting and in voiceover, but not necessarily the origins of the voices they do. Now, Tracks was voiced by Michael McConaughey, and in this interview, he breaks down the origins of Trax's unique way of speaking.
Trax, with that rather arch Harvard lockjaw, I am tremendous approach, was rooted a lot in what Jim Backus had done in Gilligan's Island as Thurston Howell III. That particular standard characterization actually goes back to Borscht Belt Vaudeville. It's called the Harvard lockjaw, because apparently you had to have tetanus in order to speak that way.
Now, this is also one of a series of episodes that takes place in New York City, and this goes back to something I had mentioned probably in previous episodes, that they were cranking out a lot of television at this point in time, and I feel like there were independent little work teams, work groups within Sunbow, kind of designing episodes and building, one, a mythology together, but not necessarily with the other writers or other production teams, and then two, creating some sort of continuous arc between episodes, because there will be some reoccurrence of New York and some of the characters we meet in this episode. And New York in the 80s was a great place to get a car stolen. Trax and Blaster start the episode by getting stolen by two punk rockers who rock out to cold slither on Blaster. Optimus Prime and the police show up as part of their joint effort to arrest car thieves, and they arrest these car thieves. And interesting note here is that the police car that shows up has suicide doors, and I don't think I've ever seen a cop car with suicide doors. Now, for those of you who don't know what those are the ones that kind of, where the rear doors open outward, but towards the back of the car. So normally a car door opens towards the front of the car. This would open towards the back. That is certainly odd to see, and just a weird piece of animation. Now we find out that Sparkplug has a garage in New York City that is also connected to an Autobot secret base, so Sparkplug's business must be doing good for him to open a New York City location. Trax, by the way, loves New York, and is cooped up inside, bored with the Autobots that he's hanging out with, decides to go for a ride. While he's out, he almost gets carjacked again, because New York in the 80s. Good time to get a car stolen. In the midst of that, he crashes his front hood, parks to recover, and is found in an alley by a guy who has never stolen the car, but needs to because he promised a bunch of gangsters that he would by midnight, and that is a kid by the name of Raoul, played by Michael Caine. And it's interesting to note here that if you remember our Marvel UK episode a few weeks back, very similar story happened where Trax was damaged fighting Rumble, the red one, and was found in an alley by a bunch of 2-bit thieves. So this seems to be common for Trax if these were one continuity, but it's certainly a parallel to that story. So Raoul decides that since he's stumbled upon this crashed up Corvette Stingray, it's his, and technically that's stealing him, so he took him. So Trax has now been stolen 3 times in the first 5 minutes of this episode. Now, while Raoul tries to repair Trax, the Autobots are out scouting for Trax in New York City. This includes lots of scenes of New York, and we're going to find that there are a lot of interesting pieces of signage in and around this universe's New York City. It's some weirder things just in some of these sequences, like so when the Autobots are looking for Trax, Huffer is driving around, and Hoist, the tow truck, is in robot mode, driving Huffer from his driver's seat. So that's odd, number one. And then Cosmos, who turns into a UFO, just casually flying around Manhattan through the west side. Now, I've worked on the west side of Manhattan. I've seen a lot of weird things on the west side of Manhattan. I've not seen a UFO flying over the streets. So we find out, as we mentioned earlier, that Raul has promised a car to a group of mobsters known as the Geddes brothers. And they promised them by midnight. And at 12:01, the Geddes brothers decide to stop by and shake down Raul. Now, they have some impeccable timing. I gotta tell you, 12:01, they're following this kid around. Like, if you're following this kid around, why not just steal the car yourself? Because clearly you have nothing better to do. And it's at this moment that Trax turns into his robot mode, steps in. Him and Raul then give chase to the gangsters. While they're chasing around New York City, there's a casino sign in the place called Casino Folie, and they're promoting their Fokker game. That is Fokker game. And it turns out the Geddes brothers are working with the Decepticons. And of course, they're working with the Decepticons in New Jersey. Powerglide at this point still patrolling for Prowl sees Starscream, and he and Cosmos chase him down into a very busy shopping mall at after midnight in New York City. Again, it is a Friday night in New York. They established that in the episode. Things are busy. I don't know if there's a shopping mall open at 12 o'clock, post 12 o'clock in New York. There's bars, not necessarily a shopping mall. In any event, Starscream escapes by flying through the ceiling, and the two Autobots that can fly do not chase him. From here, Prime makes this crazy leap of logic that Starscream is going to the New Jersey Pine Barrens. I guess he's going to hang out with the Jersey Devil.
We're the devils! The devils!
Turns out there, the Geddes brothers have delivered 500 cars to the Decepticons, and the Constructicons are using them for something. And their version of a chop shop is Scrapper and a conveyor belt. And Scrapper is chopping these cars up with a sword. Not an energy sword, but an actual, like, medieval sword. Again, why? I'm not entirely sure. And that'll take us to the second commercial break, and I want to just pause here because there's actually something new in this commercial break. One of the going to break bumpers is the Constructicon hook, and that is a new bumper. We come back, and Raul tries to save Trax from the Decepticons because Trax has decided to pretend to be a stolen car and is about to get chopped with a sword. Trax and Raul flee. They're chased by Rumble, the blue one, and Ravage. The rest of the Autobots arrive in New Jersey, and Sideswipe proceeds to kick the crap out of Ravage. So the Autobots regroup, and Optimus Prime figures out Megatron's plan.
So, Megatron's reconverting the stolen cars into vehicles that can drive on their own.
Now, I'm not quite sure how Optimus figured out this part of Megatron's plan. They certainly don't show us anything before that, as far as I remember watching this episode. But the Decepticons are essentially Google making self-driving cars that they're going to unleash on New York City to terrorize New York City. Now, neat thing here is that these cars are now headed to New York, and the Autobots are there on their way to protect New York. These cars can transform, and they all transform into the same robot mode, despite having very different vehicle modes all around. It's kind of neat, actually, to see this, and I think this is one missed opportunity so far of something that hasn't been made into a toy. As the Autobots fight these, for lack of a better word, Viacons, and I know that's an official term later on, but I think this is kind of one of the first inclination of something being very similar to Decepticon vehicle drones, and I'm surprised this hasn't gotten retconned into Viacons. As the Autobots are fighting these Viacons, and I'm saying that with air quotes, one of the marquees on a movie theater in New York reads Transformers the movie showing at those theaters, and I have to think that was an inside joke, because Transformers the movie itself was definitely in production at some point in season 2, and this seems like a way for them to have a little fun with the concept. So the cars keep coming, and Blaster decides to jam the signal controlling the cars. At this point, Raoul storms Decepticon headquarters back in New Jersey and is captured by Megatron. Megatron threatens to kill Raoul in front of the Autobots, but Raoul, whose other option for the night other than stealing the car was to do some graffiti, defeats Megatron by opening up his abdomen panel and filling it with spray paint. Then tracks Raoul and the Autobots. They get away, head back to New York, where Sparkplug, Wheeljack, Hoist, Ratchet, and now Raoul will dismantle all of the stolen cars and rebuild them into normal cars. So yeah, just in hindsight on this episode, one, it's written by David Wise, and we all know what that means. And this episode's actually pretty rare, as it has nothing recycled by David Wise for or from a previous or future work. But it is interesting to note, as I mentioned earlier, about multiple production teams and the lack of communication between them. This isn't the first time Megatron has unleashed an army of vehicle drones on New York City. If you remember back to when we covered City of Steel earlier in Season 2, Megatron had made battle taxis that he unleashed on New York. And so between that and these awesome little drone designs that were from this episode, there's certainly a lot of opportunity for troop building figures in the future, should the Hasbro design team ever think of going that way. Also worth noting from this episode, the Masterpiece version of Trax that was released just a few years ago did include a miniature Raoul figure along with a miniature version of Blaster to place in his back seat. And that will take us to the middle episode of shows we're covering in Transformers University today, and that will be Season 2, Episode 28, overall Episode 44, Child's Play by Beth Bornstein. Now, Beth Bornstein was an animation writer in the 80s into the early 90s and has since left the business, but she still writes under her married name, Beth Bornstein Dunnington, and she writes a blog called Waking Up in Hawaii. Now, this episode is an interesting one at that, because it contains a lot of weirdness, and it starts, weirdly enough, inside a baseball stadium, a full baseball stadium, where the Decepticons have built a space bridge in the middle of the field. And I'm not quite sure how they pulled that off so quickly, or how an entire stadium full of people didn't notice it on their way in. And we start with the, quote, general manager of the stadium with this request.
As general manager of this stadium, I respectfully request that you allow us to play ball.
Now, the two things I find weird is general manager of the stadium is an odd title in baseball. Usually it's general manager of the team. And he is much more concerned with getting the game in than, I don't know, removing the space bridge from the field, or the fans' safety, or the safety of the players on the field. And thus, Thrust loads his arm cannon with baseballs and fires them at the players. Some of those players actually attempt to hit or catch the ball. And speaking of catch, Soundwave and Skywarp decide to play catch with a human as the ball. And this whole baseball sequence is just loaded with bad puns and turns of phrases on baseball things. And during the course of the melee, Ravage chases a player around the bases. Starscream decides to try and murder some fans by swooping in jet mode and scooping them up on his wings. Then the Autobots arrive, and Optimus Prime is no less corny.
Okay, Decepticons, it's our turn at bat.
Starscream decides to then release the two humans from his wing, but fortunately Inferno has an entire safety net built into his ladder and yells, "That is strike one." Then Brawn and Soundwave showdown again, according to TF Wiki, as Brawn defeats Soundwave soundly. This is now, if you're keeping score at home, 5-1 in favor of Brawn. And of course, Optimus Prime observes that is strike two, Dan. Bumblebee and Thrust actually decide to play some actual baseball. And little note here, Bumblebee, left-handed hitter. From there, Optimus Prime steps in. The fight continues, and some of the characters end up within the space bridge. The Autobots are trying to take control of the bridge, and Megatron shoots the controls, which sets off the bridge, and anyone inside of it is sent away. That happens to be Prime, Perceptor, Smokescreen, Starscream, Ravage, Bumblebee, Inferno, Thrust, and Soundwave. They all arrive on an alien planet and are attacked by some weird creatures. The Decepticons, that is, are attacked by these weird creatures, and Optimus Prime decides it's a good time to leave them, roll out, and they do, including Perceptor, who rolls out in microscope mode. It's just kind of neat because his toy did have tank treads on the bottom. On Earth, the space bridge explodes inside of the stadium, and the Autobots say, "All right, let's go home." Yeah, no worries about any humans being in there or any collateral damage. Back in space, the Autobots there realize they are on a giant planet and are very much toy-sized.
It's a giant boy! Actually, it's all a matter of perspective. We're miniature robots to him.
Turns out the boy's cat is named Nitro, voiced by Frank Welker. The boy himself is named Aaron, and he is voiced by Mona Marshall. He has a hamster with an elephant head on it named Booper, which he tosses Ravage into, and Ravage and Booper are involved in a chase on the hamster wheel. Aaron shows Thrust to his mom and dad, played by Marshall again, and the dad played by Walker Edmiston.
This one was a robot, but he turned into a plane. You see? Now he's a robot again.
Mom decides, time to call the authorities, and a scientist steps in, played by John Stevenson, to examine both the Autobots and Decepticons, and figures the best way to examine them is to cut them open. Aaron grabs the Autobots and runs for it. In the course of that, he runs into his local bully named Marty, also voiced by Mona Marshall. And while the adults chase the kid, Ravage frees himself and the rest of the Decepticons. Now, the Decepticons decide to follow Aaron and the bots and fly looking for them, including Ravage, who has never flown as far as I know. And while he's flying, he's running in place, kind of like the old Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer special. His legs move in midair like he's running. Aaron drops the Autobots in the sewer to make a getaway and tells the Autobots to meet them. The Decepticons follow, and Soundwave and Perceptor fight each other using a broken paperclip and a pencil, respectively. The Autobots eventually defeat the Decepticons in the sewer and find Aaron's house with a little help from Nitro, his alien cat thing. the Autobots need to find a way home, and Perceptor plans to modify Aaron's telescope to get him home and send a beam that will transport them back to Earth. But the Decepticons arrive and steal the beam home. From there, the Autobots rig a spaceship from Aaron's toy rocket and begin their journey home. Now, the rest of this trip will actually be chronicled in a future episode, but not for a few more episodes. In fact, not in any of the episodes we're going to cover this time around. Also worth noting that that's where the story ends, but the planet was eventually retconned with a name. The name of this planet was called Brobdingnag, based off the name of a very similar place in the famed book Gulliver's Travels, and that was done in the Allspark Almanac 2, published in 2010. Now again, the fact that this is an episode that has a continuing story but is continued much later on is another bit of evidence that there were multiple teams at Sunbow building kind of arcs as they went. And finally, how big is Aaron and his planet if he is huge to the Transformers? It's kind of very meta that they're toy-sized, and they're also toys in real life. But if you think that Optimus Prime is 30 or 40 feet tall, that means this planet must be huge, and the adults on this planet must be like the size of skyscrapers, or pretty close to it. Or actually, like a regular home would probably be the size of a skyscraper here. So the planet that they landed on must be enormous. So for this toy rocket to actually make it into orbit is pretty impressive. And this episode, for being riddled with animation errors and just some serious weirdness, is one that tends to stick with people who grew up in that era. And one of those such people is my good friend Gabriel Owens, the Salty Seaman.
Hey folks, Salty Seaman here. Looking at Child's Play, a definite favorite and standout. Even during times where I didn't really had seen the episodes very often between, being a little kid around 10 or 11, and rewatched them as a young adult. This one always, if I thought of a Transform episode, was one that always stood out to me for what is basically the most blatant toy advertisement in toy cartoon advertising history. And just the excitement of the episode, it works because it is an episode you can imagine reenacting in your own room with your own toys, and you can be that kid, which is why it works based on actually driving a child's imagination versus crass advertising. And also, I really was a fan of the opening baseball segment. It's a lot of cheesy baseball puns. I was a big baseball fan as a kid. You have the idiotic outfielder trying to catch a ball shot from a Transformer cannon. That guy's it's a good thing he decided to be an athlete, not a mechanical engineer. A little bit of Soundwave having a bit of fun. Again, Soundwave gets a bad rap for being kind of a nothing, robotic character. He's got some moments of fun here and there, and there's a pretty funny moment where a good chunk of Megatron's troops, along with a bunch of Autobots, and disappear through the space bridge, which kind of starts not only this episode, but actually a mini arc of Transformers through space, which is a new take on the series. Another reason I think I kind of remember this and all the episodes, because that was kind of an exciting thing as a kid when there was some continuity going on. It wasn't direct 1 and 2 parters, but Megatron's cry of dismay is over his energon cubes, and no mention of Soundwave at all. I think other than the crass salesmanship here is just the kind of subversion of the Transformers' place in the world, as they're basically near invulnerable apex predators as we see them on Earth. They can only hurt each other. Nothing else really affects them for the most part, other than the occasional gizmo of the week, whether it be comes from the humans. But otherwise, they're never in a position of danger unless it's Autobot on Decepticon or transform on Transformers. So in this world, we see where they're essentially helpless. You know, they are unable to defeat even, you know, basic kids' toys, which, you know, just aren't, you know, you assume aren't like military grade. They're just made of this incredibly powerful material, like for the most part can withstand their best attacks. So we know by the time the alien child shows up that, you know, they are essentially helpless to him, and he can do whatever he wants. And and that's a fun way to treat your characters, especially when they exist in this world of, you know, invulnerability as a rule. And I'm sure the more science-minded of us could explain how the gravity on this planet would not allow this to be possible, and, you know, they should probably be crushed as soon as they arrive. But it's a story. It's for story purposes. You know, that's kind of stuff you just really got to let go. And before I go, just a couple of points to wrap this up. I know Ant's doing the major story recap here and probably pointing out a lot of the really cool little details on here. So just a couple other things that's also fun to mention is the kid is not a nice kid. Every time I remember this episode, I remember him being a lot nicer than he actually is. He's not quite Sid from Toys, which is a good comparison, or not quite an Elmira, but he's in that ballpark on the lower end. There's also a scene where Bumblebee's yelling at Starscream, and Prime kind of comes to him from behind and puts his hand over his mouth, and it just kind of lingers there. And it's kind of like the screen cap that launched 1,000 ships, but I'll digress on that topic right here. And, of course, the most egregious, speaking of science, is Perceptor building a workable rocket ship out of a toy rocket ship. We get no explanation, but we do get Optimus Prime saying, "Just do it," which is really great. It's like, go ahead and perform a miracle of science, Perceptor. Don't bother me with the details. This is a fantastic episode. It's almost Microbots Redux, you know, because you get the thing of the Transformers being really small and fighting with the environment, much like your toys would. You get the playability value of this episode just through the roof. It's a fantastic vehicle for selling toys, and I love it. Back to you, Ant.
Don't forget, you can catch Gabe on his YouTube channel, youtube.com/recharge138. That's where you can find the Salty Seaman, and you can catch him on Twitter at recharge138. And that takes us to episode 29 of the season 45 overall, Quest for Survival, written by Reed Robbins and Peter Sachs. And this is the second and final episode written by this pair, whose previous contribution was Countdown to Extinction. So this episode starts off with the Insecticons attacking field workers again. And the Autobots show up, including Skids. And now I have to correct one thing that I had said in the previous episode, that Skids' second appearance was in Quest for Survival. I had them flipped, so his first appearance is actually in Quest for Survival. And also among those Autobots is Smokescreen, who was off-planet last episode. The Autobots pretty much lose to the Insecticons and retreat, head back to base, and Optimus Prime is there, and he had sent Bumblebee, Cosmos, and Spike off-planet for a special mission to Floron 3 to pick up some robotic insecticide. Yeah, you heard me right. Robotic insecticide comes in a giant aerosol spray can about the size of Spike. While flying away, there's an asteroid with tentacles that attacks Cosmos and leaves elements of itself on him. Back on Earth, the horde of Insecticons, and I should point this out, the Insecticons here are cloned en masse, so there are hundreds of them, led by Bombshell, Kickback, and Shrapnel. They arrive at Decepticon headquarters and transfer some of the energy they've collected, the energon they've collected, for refinement and use for the rest of the Decepticons. Cosmos and company crash land on Earth, and Cosmos is tangled now in these alien tentacles. Bumblebee and Spike head back to base, and we find out that Bumblebee has some of these spores on him as well. So the Autobots head out to rescue Cosmos, and Laserbeak is spying now. Laserbeak will report back to Megatron and Soundwave as Perceptor realizes these plants are something called Morphobots, which they believe were extinct. And they're not just regular Morphobots. They are hungry Morphobots. Megatron decides to head to the area where Cosmos has crashed to steal the robotic insecticide, and sends Thrust to order the Insecticons to not go to that valley until it is clear. The Insecticons do not believe him and fight with Thrust before he flees. The Decepts are the first on the scene, but decide to let the Autobots do the dirty work, and the Autobots cannot cut through what is now a field of Morphobot plants. They try to cut through with Warpath in tank mode, trying to shoot his way through. That doesn't work. Ironhide decides to try to freeze them with liquid nitrogen. That does not work. Then Blaster decides to rock them out with a little bit of Cold Slither, and he half transforms into his boombox mode. So he's his arms are away, his head is away, but his legs are still out walking around as a walking cassette deck. And Optimus, none too happy with the song selection.
Who says plants aren't intelligent? The Morphobots are repelled by your music.
You know, as corny as it is, I kind of like corny, angry old dad Optimus in season 2. It's just weird. He's full of dad jokes like this one.
Good work, Blaster. You've just gone platinum.
And the Autobots go and rescue Cosmos and the robotic insecticide, thanks to a little bit of Cold Slither. The Decepticons then decide to attack, and Megatron, who was hoping to use the robotic insecticide to rid himself of the Insecticons, decides to blow it up anyway. And you know what that means, right?
That could mean the entire human race will starve.
Wow, Spike. That is one morbid leap of logic for Spike. And I've got to say, I think parts of this episode were cut because what we don't really have expressly pointed out to us is that this episode is one about hunger. You have hungry Morphobots and you have hungry Insecticons. And the Insecticons are eating up farmland and food on Earth, while the Morphobots have just arrived and are starving. So this essentially becomes a story of plants versus insects. And at the end of this episode, the Insecticons arrive. They see the Morphobots as food and try to eat them. And to their surprise, they get eaten by the Morphobots, so much so that the Morphobots eat the entire Insecticon army, aside from the 3 generals of Bombshell, Kickback, and Shrapnel. The Decepticons flee, and the Autobots have won, so they decide they need to get the Morphobots off the planet, and they build a spaceship to launch them into space. Now, I don't know exactly how they, one, built the spaceship since they're trapped on Earth, or just refused to leave, and then 2, got the Morphobots in there without getting eaten or infected by them. And finally, we end the episode with the rocket taking off, and then Perceptor calling in a bit late, saying, hey, I've got some of these in my lab still. Do we have another rocket? And that wraps up a very silly episode. And, you know, this episode's also pretty Cosmos heavy. And it's also another unique voice on the show. And again, this is one that was voiced by Michael McConaughey. And I know previously, not in this episode, but in a previous episode, Gabe had mentioned that he had thought Cosmos' voice was some kind of Hispanic dialect, South American maybe, and he's actually not too far off. And so here is Michael McConaughey on his inspiration for Cosmos and the trickiness of doing that voice.
Cosmos gave me so much trouble because he's based loosely on Peter Lorre. But It's a much more strong and masculine and forceful Peter Lorre than Peter Lorre ever was. And the problem with doing Peter Lorre, who is one of the standard impressions for people who are doing voice impressions back when I was growing up, is that unless you get a really firm grip on him, he kind of slides off into some really bad Mexican accent. Cosmos is out there, Optimus Prime, we're being invaded again, which is about that far off from Pancho Villa.
And just for reference, here is a little bit of actual Peter Lorre acting dialogue.
I, a poor peasant, have conquered science. Why can't I conquer love?
And that takes us to the final episode we are covering on Transformers University today. That would be episode 30 of the season 46, overall, The Secret of Omega Supreme, written by David Wise. And in this one, we start out with the Constructicons piloting a ship to move an asteroid into orbit. They call Megatron, and there's an interesting animation error here where Sideswipe is standing next to Megatron awaiting this call. And it turns out it was supposed to be Soundwave if you're going by the next few shots, to let him know that this asteroid is now in place. Cosmos is patrolling space and finds the asteroid and the Constructicons and reports back to Optimus. Optimus decides he needs to find someone, but where is he going?
To talk to the only other Autobot who can fly into outer space.
Oh, come on, Optimus. What about Skyfire? He went into space at least once, if not twice. All right. So, if you remember back, Skyfire is actually written out of the show on purpose because of his the legal issues around his toy and show models. So Optimus Prime decides to drive out to talk to Omega Supreme, and he is calling out for Omega Supreme in the woods. Omega Supreme is hiding. Now, how do you hide a, 6-story tall robot tank rocket ship defense-based thing is beyond me. But Omega comes out, and Optimus tells him about the Constructicons, which sets Omega Supreme off. He is not happy hearing the names of the Constructicons thrown out there, and Optimus realizes he's struck a nerve. So he asks Omega Supreme to explain.
What happened between you and the Constructicons, Omega?
Question irrelevant. Answer private.
I want to know about it.
Order received. We'll talk.
Can you talk like a normal Autobot?
Just this once, I will talk the way I did on Cybertron.
Wait, so Omega chooses to talk in logical statements and small chunks? That is weird on its own, but it is origin time. It is flashback time, and we find out that Omega Supreme is a Guardian robot, and we meet a doctor named Doc, apparently, who's there just giving him a checkup before he heads back to his post as the Guardian of the Crystal City. It's just another Sunday in a tired old street, and the Constructicons show up as they were his friends, and of course they built this city. And we find out this is kind of a second origin for the Constructicons. The first one being that they were built on Earth back in Season 1, Heavy Metal War. But in this episode, we also find out that Megatron had this device called the Robo Smasher that he used to reprogram Cybertronians. And in the example we see, he reprograms this cool generic-looking robot, which would eventually be retconned into a type of robot transformer Cybertronian called the Gyronian Sentry. And Megatron uses the Robo Smasher to reprogram the Constructicons. And it's also funny to note here that all of the animation of the Constructicons at this point only show 5 of them. Bone Crusher is missing from the group. The Constructicons then head back to Crystal City, and tell Omega Supreme that there is an attack on the capital and he is needed there. They tell him they'll guard Crystal City, but instead they destroy it. Omega Supreme realizes his mistake and heads back to Crystal City, hunting for the Constructicons. Eventually he captures them and tries to reprogram them, and now Bone Crusher is now with the Constructicons in these scenes, but the reprogramming did not work. We find out the Robo Smasher cannot be undone, and we also find out the Constructicons can now combine into Devastator, and Omega Supreme is now attacked by Devastator. He fights them off and the Robo Smasher, which attempts to convert him to a Decepticon, but it fails as he destroys it and defeats the Constructicons, and we find out what happened from Omega Supreme and how it led him to where he is today.
They fled Cybertron in a starship.
And you followed them.
I did, for millions of years, across the galaxies.
And then you heard they'd found where Megatron was and rejoined him, here on Earth.
I followed. I have been waiting.
Now, back on the asteroid, the Decepticons are mining some of this ore that makes it up and is very energy rich, and Cosmos steals a piece and heads back to Autobot base. Omega Supreme is sent to the asteroid and flies up there with his docking bay attached to his rocket mode. Again, it looks like they're used kind of like vertical stabilizers on a jet, but it's just an odd piece of animation. Now, while he's on his way, Teletran 1 finds out that the asteroid is actually alive. Omega Supreme ignores radio calls up to him, but instead fights the Constructicons, and in the course of this punches the asteroid, which forces it to hatch a Robo Dragon Scorpion thing, which immediately heads to Earth. And during the course of this, I realized that Omega Supreme might be the most metal of Transformers. There are some lines here that can totally just be put to some distorted riffing.
Creature lives, you die.
Now, this newly hatched baby Robo Dragon Scorpion thing is very hungry and is heading to San Francisco for some rice-a-roni. It turns out the asteroid is its food, and Omega Supreme needs to get this thing back to the asteroid in order to save San Francisco. Devastator and Omega continue their fight on Earth, and then Prime gives him this speech on revenge.
This is more important than revenge.
Prime, move.
You caused that thing to hatch. You're responsible. It's happening again, Omega. It's happening right here on Earth. San Francisco's going to be destroyed. Are you going to let it all happen again? For something as useless as revenge?
At this point, Omega realizes the error of his ways and decides to fight the Robo Dragon Scorpion baby and lead it back to the asteroid. But Megatron has had plans to destroy this asteroid, and as he's about to fire, his controls are blown up by Optimus Prime, who was smart enough to realize that, yeah, Megatron probably had a hand in all this and needs to be taken out of the equation. The Robo Dragon Scorpion baby thing eats a bit of the asteroid and then flies off in the other direction into space. And the episode ends with Omega Supreme rolling a tear at his lost Crystal City and his need for revenge. Oh man, what a good episode that one is. I really like The Secret of Omega Supreme, and it's another David Wise episode without any sort of recycling. And that will wrap up this edition of Transformers University. I want to remind you, New York Comic Con coming up this week. Please subscribe to the YouTube channel, youtube.com/TFU.INFO, where I will be doing all sorts of coverage. I will be live from the show floor, and I will be sitting down with the Hasbro Transformers design team to talk about what else they have coming up for the rest of 2018 and 2019 and beyond. Now, if you enjoy the show, please check out our Patreon, patreon.com/TFU.INFO, where you can sign up for as little as $1, and you would have heard this episode a full day early, at the very least, plus all sorts of other great benefits to being one of our students over on Patreon. Now, if you'd like to get in touch with me, best way to do it is Twitter, twitter.com/TFU_info or at TFU_info. And, of course, you can catch me on Facebook or Instagram, either one of those .com/TFU_info. And, of course, the figure archive on the web, www.tfu.info. Next time on the show, we're doing something that turned out to be a lot of fun last time around when I did it for 1984. We're going to do it again. We're going to take a look at the tech spec numbers and functions of the newest characters from 1985. As we go 1985 by the numbers. Till then, see ya.